How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm fine there.
Oh,
How are you
delightful.
doing?
I am doing well. I'm doing well. We're cutting up tomatoes and trying to make marinara sauce, so we will see if we succeed. As you know, squash all comes at once. So we are
Yes,
also eating a lot of squash, frying it with squash tomatoes, etc., so forth. And your headband, by the way. That's super cool.
thank you. I wear a lot of hats. For strange and funny reasons. I had an acquaintance and then an experience with some fabulous medicine women from Guyana who
Wow.
initiated me into a combination into their unbelievable syncretistic practice between thank you, honey, Anglican Christianity and indigenous African traditions, a fusion I've never seen in any other culture. It's not Haiti, it's not Mexico. It was so amazing. And they were amazing. And I got many instructions, not all of which I have followed faithfully, but one of them was important for women of spirit to wear head covering, which is like St. Paul's going, oh, well, I tried to tell you. So I don't do it exactly for that reason. Partly it's just it feels good, but I think of it every time I put these on.
Well, that is like, well, Daddy, you just gotta wear it right. I was like, oh, okay, I'll see what I can do, Miss Grace. I will do. I really enjoy, by the way, the point in your last Substack on how with Deleuze, speech is a kind of invitation into a world, where you're stepping into something and how you're associating that with ex nihilo, creating ex nihilo. I've been doing a lot recently with Ivan Illich, and he in Tools of
Ah,
Conveniality, he really stresses that we don't understand. And then he has that book on ABCs of alphabetization. We really don't understand the shift from the written word, from the oral tradition to the written word. And just imagine that you're going about your day and someone starts speaking to you in a world where text is not written out of. It would feel very ex nihilo. It really would feel as if
it
you're
would. Yeah, oh,
encountering a horizon.
that's interesting, Daniel. Oh gosh, you always have a nice little angle of vision there that I really like. I got a lot of energy. I haven't been able to cast this into any form yet. Got a lot of energy from listening to this person on YouTube who reads Deleuze aloud, just as text. And he read aloud a seminar that Deleuze did on Spinoza that I don't see easily in publication. I'm not seeing it either in French and English. I only looked a little bit, but I didn't see it. It's very, very free and spontaneous.
Mm.
It uses the word God without scare quotes and not entirely just in citation. So that's fun for me, right? and and it plays around. It really riffs on creation.
Mm.
And so I got the energy for a lot of these uneven substacks I'm doing from listening to that, and I'll be listening to it. I'm going to a retreat this weekend. I'm going to be listening in the car just again. So,
Well,
so
that well,
that's
that is wonderful. Well, I think it's interesting with Deleuze, vitalism, with Bergson, or the new materialism, as different people talk about it. I think it is much easier to kind of understand some of those metaphysical impulses from an oral tradition versus a written tradition. Because in an oral tradition, the other thing that Illich really stresses is that it used to be that words were always face to face. Like you always had to be facing someone. And so language and the communication of information was always tied to social capital and personal encounter. And it's also interesting because in a book called The Invention of News by Andrew Pagry, I believe, he talks about how in the past people didn't they were like, how can you trust news that you read off a piece of paper?
yeah,
The only news you can trust is from someone face to face. Where today it's the exact opposite. If someone tells you face to face, we don't believe it until it's written down, put it in writing. Where the very
yeah.
basis of truth now is the written word. Where in the past it was they were suspicious of what was written because the person wasn't there to question and the person wasn't there creating an empathetic relation. Like it's easier to lie to someone on paper, much harder to lie to them face to face, right? Unless maybe you're
Right.
Iago or something like that. And so it's interesting how the experience of information was once tied to the face in a Levinas sort of sense. It was tied to communal capital. And now, where there's such a concern about the collapse of social capital, whether it be a Putman and Bowling Alone, whether it be a Hunter, all these sociologists, it is interesting to think that the very way we receive information can contribute to us really being isolated in our own hermeneutical horizon. Whereas in your Substack, this idea of the Bible being a kind of invitation into a horizon. Why don't you step into Genesis? Let's step into thinking about the construction of the universe according to this horizon. And the horizon appears kind of ex nihilo from the person that is speaking it. And we don't live in a world, I guess the point is we don't live in a world anymore where we so readily experience information as a horizon. Whereas when it was face-to-face, you almost always did experience it as a horizon because you were encountering a person that brought with them a world, that brought with them a fundamental mystery because you couldn't access their consciousness. Whereas now information, it's almost like I guess what I was trying to word, I'd be curious what you think of this with Ivan Illich. It's almost like we've traded mystery for interpretation. Like there is a kind of uncertainty, but it's the uncertainty. It's the uncertainty of interpreting words, but it's not the same as the mystery of the person. And there's always some degree, like, let's put it this way. All mystery entails interpretation, but not all interpretation entails mystery in the same way, right? And it's almost like what you see is distinctions have to be made now between interpretation, mystery, and uncertainty. And I think often we kind of conflate those together in everyday language. Those are kind of all the same thing, when actually they seem to be metaphysically unique. And it seems like you could almost follow it from the movement of an oral tradition to a written tradition. It's the movement from uncertainty of mystery that you then honor to now it's the uncertainty of interpretation that you're out to dominate or to deconstruct and kind of throw off the table. And it's interesting how Deleuze is almost like a return to mystery as a horizon.
Two footnotes to that. One is Max Mueller, great comparative religionist, always made the point, which he thought he could prove and document, that oral traditions, transmission through oral traditions is more accurate than transmission in writing. And he thought he could show that in the Sanskrit tradition, which is very interesting in itself. And secondly, as I always tell my students, with writing, you have no feedback loop. And that's why it's so frightening. You have this kind of ham-handed toolkit of diacritical marks and grammatical inflections and punctuation, but it does not do all the work that is done spontaneously by interacting with someone as you speak. How often do we change a discourse in mid-flow just because we're watching the face of the person we're talking to, So I'm with you on this. I really like the absence of conflation between mystery and interpretation. I'm just so aware, as we all are, I think, of how absolutely corrosive the ham-handed use of the hermeneutic of suspicion has been, totally. I mean, I spent most of the first part of my T.S. Eliot book talking about Eliot had a very clear and very worked out his understanding of what it was to read was extremely clear. And he thought of it in terms of the three Sanskrit terms, data, dhanmata, dayadvam. Give, sympathize, control. First you give and sympathize, and then you control, right? And without that initial moment of surrender, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, you cannot interpret, you cannot do anything with this text except consume it, right? So I like this. Are you doing this Ivan Illich thing? I mean, I'm still trying to grasp the array of your archive, Dan. Are you doing the Ivan Illich thing on Substack or on the YouTube, or on where are you working on that?
You're very kind. So a few things. First off, Cleo, I think one of the reasons we conflate the reliability of the written word and say, oh, writing is reliable, is because we conflate its reliability with the force of law. Most of writing has law behind of it, and the fear of law is projected onto the written word to make us think it's the writing that's reliable, but it's the threat behind the writing. actually, the truth of the matter is, like you said, when you're face to face with someone, it's empathy comes in, you see the looks on their face. And it's interesting to think that if you were to compare writing and spoken word absent of law, outside of the threat of law, spoken word is far more reliable. It's that, and then what that would also mean, though, that I think Ivan Illich's kind of, that we try to bring out in the paper, is that means writing actually is in favor of power in the state and law and things like that, where speaking is more decentralization. And what's interesting, I was speaking with Tim at Voicecraft, this Zoom.
And just say, how would you, I mean, that to me is sounding very Derrida. Would you agree or would you distinguish?
No, I think there is a lot of Derrida there. Absolutely. I think he absolutely understood that the metaphysics of the signifier and the signified favored, like Western metaphysics as he understood it. Now, I have some critiques of Derrida that are not so much saying he was wrong, but that not all metaphysics are magnifiers of the signifier. I think there are metaphysics of apprehension, phenomenology, and I would have to go into that. However, the metaphysics of the divide, the gap, as I call it the metaphysics of the book versus the metaphysics of the apprehension, those absolutely favor power, just like Derrida understood. And again, you know, Derrida and James K. Smith, he has that lovely book on Derrida. And, you know, Derrida always said that deconstruction was a matter of justice, right? You know, it was about justice. It wasn't nihilism for Derrida. I once had a friend, and I really liked what my friend said. He said, it's, you know, it's okay to be Plato. It's sometimes problematic to be a Platonist. It's okay to be Aristotle. It's problematic to be an Aristotelian. And what he was getting at is usually the original thinker is very nuanced and they have a complete vision. It tends to be a lot of the followers that maybe miss some of the key points. So no, I think it's very Derridian. I think it's very fair. I think it and as you know, Derrida's deconstruction is aligning with the clearing in Heidegger, the making space for the coming forth of being. So for Derrida, deconstruction and reconstruction are always tied together. Unfortunately, that part of the equation with the more popular understanding is not always there, in my opinion.
Oh, also, even in him, there's, as he well knew, as I believe he agonized over, there's a sort of a late letter he wrote that a friend of mine often quotes about what haunted him when he woke up in the middle of the night, and how he used to tear up and get very, very worried for fear he was leading the youth astray.
Interesting.
It was really an active agony for him. He was a lovely dude, Dan. I mean,
wow.
Once heard him in a conversation where he was being pressed very, very hard on whether he was doing anything different than negative theology. In fact, I was pressing him somewhat hard on that. And I thought I could nail him. And he looked up at the group of us that were talking with him. And again, there was this poignance and this almost tearful, he didn't cry, but I mean, the look on his face was a look of acute sorrow. And he said, the difference between me and Meister Eckhart is he can begin and end with prayer, but I am not a man of hope.
Interesting.
And it was just because I felt my heart contract, you know, it was so poignant, so poignant. So what I'm leading up to say is, yes, about the fact he is more nuanced, but he also has this problem of endless deferral. You know, he's prolegomena after prolegomena after prolegomena, and he's terrified of that risk of stepping in, you know. And, you know, at one point he talks also about the, do you know his, sorry to go on my Derrida riff here. I'll stop in a minute.
Please.
Start on Derrida. I don't stop. You know his lovely book of Spirit? It's
yes.
my favorite Derrida text. And in that, he talks about Heidegger dropping the scare quotes, right, around the word spirit in the rectorship address when he had them there before. And it's completely conscious and deliberate. And he talks about that as a moment. It marks the moment where Heidegger lost his shit. You know, just the dropping of those quotation marks. That's why I love Derrida. He's the best reader in the world. He's a total new critic. He spotted those diacritical marks, right? He turns around and he says, it isn't only that when he dropped those scare quotes, Heidegger lost his sense of critical distance, lost his ethics, lost his moorings, right? He's saying that was a fascist use of the term spirit. But then he goes deeper and he says at the same time, he had to drop those marks if he was going to get any purchase at all on what he really wanted to do, right? He has that generosity to push it one step further and to redeem the old man as well as damning him. But I'm saying all of this because in that he talks about how there's complicity, and he actually uses the word terror in either of those decisions, either with scare quotes or without them, right? And of course, I think he's talking about a problematic around the word spirit there that I talk about around the word God, right? So but I do think he was so almost paralyzed by a sense of the responsibility of the thought he was doing that he couldn't stop writing. He couldn't stop hacking away at the clearing and let any light really arrive. Wow. You know what I mean?
Wow.
And he constantly wrote about that, about the deferral. But he couldn't figure out any other way to play the game. You know, any other way to play the game seemed to him to reify or, you know, make logocentric or whatever. So I think the way you have said that, because you said the law stands behind the writing and the law is behind the writing is the problem. You take the law away and you don't have that problem. Where would you fill that out for me? Say more about what happens when you take that away, or whether you've got an example of that where you feel the text does not have the law behind it. Is that just an aesthetic text? Is that what we do when we aestheticize a text?
Well, first off, everything you said was magnificent. Second, I agree. That's really fascinating with your experience of Derrida in this feeling of leading the youth astray. A few things to that. You know, I always have this tension of, like, when you're trying to go deep into philosophy or deep problems, you find yourself having to write quite extensively, and it's very easy for people to lose you along the way. And there's always the tension of, oh my gosh, if people get lost, am I responsible? There's always this question of to what degree is the original writer responsible for the interpretations and even the misinterpretations. And I think that's part of the challenge, part of the weight. Second, on that spotting of the scare quotes, it makes me think of, we were talking yesterday on Blood Meridian and how suddenly at the end, the P in priest is capitalized. And I was really trying to figure that out because judge is never capitalized. It's always lowercase. And I'm also very interested if the only two present tense sections of the book is the dance at the end, which is a kind of a form of the dance of history, naked, the still point at the four quartets, and then the fence post making in the epilogue. They're both in present tense. And this drives the question of, is the judge civilization or is the judge what's outside of civilization? Which is something I'm thinking about. And Derrida was very talented at picking up on those details. So I appreciate that. Third, to your question of the Ivan Illich, that's going to be with parallax. That's going to be what I was going to say on the question of writing and law. When people go, oh, you know, write it down, it doesn't matter until it's in writing. There's this whole idea that writing has authority, but why? Because of a contract, because of a declaration, because of a constitution. There's this kind of idea that the written word has authority precisely because it's able to stand in, say, a court of law or a court of men. Anyone can read the text. I can pass it on. It's more universal. It's not bound to a particular place. And so it is more able to participate in the social order. Also, it can kind of, in a way, feel, quote unquote, more scientific because more people can observe it. More people can see it. It's not so bound to subjectivity. But the funny thing is, all of that requires a certain social contract and assumption that makes possible that authority to be around the written word. If I were to just ask you, though, Cleo, hey, do you think why do a lot of people do the Zoom calls instead of, say, a blog? Because they feel like they can get into the depths. They feel like they can examine the nuance, or they're not able to figure things out. And here's kind of the trick. In the written word, there is the gap between what the text says and the opening, like what it means, right? There's this gap that kind of opens up. When we talk, what's very interesting is instead of the feeling of a text where a gap is opening up or trying to define different things, there's more of this kind of immediate phenomenological experience of apprehension when we talk. Like you apprehend what I'm saying and I apprehend what we're saying, we're going back and forth. The reason why I think this is very important, because it gets to the Derrida problem. For me, what Derrida understood is the problem of, to put it in sociological terms with the book Belonging Again, because that's kind of the language I like to use. It's the problem that Philip Reeve pointed out between givens and constraints, or what I'll call givens and releases. What givens are is, it say 100 years ago, it was just given that your neighbor was Christian or Baptist or Methodist and you were Christian. So it was given that you had a shared background. So you were able to interact and go on and so forth and so forth. Well, this was existentially stabilizing because you didn't have to think about your worldview, could just go from there. But it was also, it risked totalitarianism because you were thoughtlessly Christian, right? Just everyone was Christian. You didn't really think about it. It was and then it could align with the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about. Well, as you start entering into pluralism and you encounter difference and you realize, oh my gosh, I could have born Hindu just as much as I was Christian, you become existentially destabilized. And when you're existentially destabilized, strongmen become tempting, fascism becomes tempting because you want to get back to that stabilization. So here's the issue, but here's the other problem. When you have givens, those also what? Oppress people, because it's just given that the white man is better than the black man, or it's just given that men should do X, Y, and Z. You don't think about it. It's the banality of evil. Well, as you tear that down, the shared background by which everyone understood everything then is lost, which leads to the opening up of the potential nihilism. But then if you don't open up that potential nihilism, you have the injustice. So what you have sociology is this problem where the very thing that oppresses is also what holds back having to face the existential anxiety that can lead to nihilism, hopelism, the givens of the social order, right? And so this is the problem, though. In order to fix it, you need to take a stand and say, well, we're going to have this be the new paradigm. But wait a minute. The moment you say this is the new paradigm, it could be a new source of what? Oppression, banality of evil. So Derrida's like, defer. But here's the problem. If you always defer, then you never have anything there to be the basis of a new social order. And this is, for me, basically the key problem. Like what Derrida understood, that he's like, he's realizing this is a massive problem, but he also realizes going back is not the answer, because that's what? That's injustice. And so where Derrida leaves us, for me, which I just often talk about in sociology because I find it's easier for people to understand the problem that Derrida is putting his finger on in sociological terms, is that you have to make a clearing so that you can have justice. But in that clearing, what are the conditions of something that can come forth to be a new basis of givens that doesn't lead to new oppression, that doesn't lead to a new banality of evil? And he's worried at the end of his life of an ever deferring.
I just had a thought that I had not had. So I did a lot of work, a whole body of work, large body of work on sacrifice, my Virgin Mary book. Okay. And I immersed myself in sacrificial theory till my eyes were rolling. And one of the things that most fascinated me, two things. One, your sense of the origin of writing is it even plays out historically, because as you know, the first written codes are written codes of law. But the other thing, one of the early uses of sacrifice was to mark or inscribe an oath, right? And in a sense, an oath needed to be made in such a way as it would travel through time and space, even if the players had died. Or were not there. So it became a form of writing. It required a written contract, or it constituted a kind of written contract. It's like in Boy Scouts when you have the club and you all mark it in blood, right?
Yes.
That marking in blood and the relationship between ink and blood there is very primary. And one of the things I wanted to do with that work on sacrifice and never did, maybe I'll think about this more, was talk about writing itself as a form of sacrifice, because you're sacrificing this lived experience, this apprehension, this face-to-face, this whatever. You're sacrificing. And in the hope of establishing something less tied to the material, more transcendental, more capable of traveling through time and space. It's a wager, like all sacrifice, because you can be so totally misunderstood. A person can take that piece of writing and make it, a source of utter oppression in some other village. You see where I'm going with that. And I think that I'm extremely interested in the point in the Hebrew Bible where people decided they had to write this stuff down, and how closely that was tied, even in the giving of the tablets of the law. It's directly tied to sacrifice. It's the sacrificial practices are going on. He comes down off the mountain and immediately they're killing animals and sacrifice, right? So there's an association here I think is very complex. I am not prepared to throw sacrifice out of the human world. I have a perpetual ongoing theological puzzle as to whether there's sacrifice in the kingdom. What do you think, Dan? You gonna opine on that for me? Yes or no? Sacrifice in the kingdom? Lay it on me.
Well, Cleo, so a few things. That's excellent. Second, I really enjoyed talking to you. Third, I think this connection between writing sacrifice law is all very good. It makes me think of an Abraham God splitting it, walking between the animal. You see this long connection between blood, writing, and law. And I think also, I also think, so the Hegelian in me always wants to say it's important not to go, oh, we made a mistake. There's always a negation sublation. There's always something gained and there's always something lost. So for example, it is hard to imagine without the written word, like William Ong says, basically the scientific treatise, like the writing transformed how humans thought and it became possible to do the scientific treatise, right? And you could get the Enlightenment and there's all the benefits that come with that. Unfortunately, with the benefits of the Enlightenment come the temptation of what David Hume understands as autonomous rationality, which is the thinking that everything can be understood without reference to anything non-rational or common life. And that becomes autonomous rationality, which is self-effacing, auto-cannibalistic, and makes possible totalitarianism, basically, because once you have the ability to create reasoning, since reasoning does not necessarily have to refer to anything outside of its own consistency and coherence, it can then totalize the world. And, David Hume suggests the possibilities of total war because of the unleashing of philosophical consciousness, which is philosophy without any binding to common life, lived experience. He's concerned about literature, culture, beauty, all of these different things, where for him, there's a difference between bad philosophy and good philosophy. And bad philosophy is philosophy that is not bound to anything non-rational or what he'll talk about as common life, sentiment, community, et cetera, so forth. Whereas good philosophy honors and respects and self-defends common life, beauty, truth, goodness, and what have you.
Thinking as you talk, yes, I'm thinking yes, but I'm also thinking Deleuze wouldn't want that common life in there.
Right.
At the same time, he would want to make the point that binding to something outside is vital.
Right.
And I think, would you say that because I'm kind of new to Deleuze, I had my Deleuze conversion only a few years ago from Derrida, so I had dismissed it for all the stupid reasons, the libertarianism, all the total misapprehensions of it. And I finally, and like all late converts, I'm like, oh my God, this is it, right? So bear with me here. I'm beginning to recover my balance a little bit, but I've had my Deleuze period. But anyway, wouldn't you say that he would kind of say that outside is nature?
So the question for me, ultimately, between like belonging and at the end going to allude for the address, which is already way, way too long. The second book is going to say the question comes down, and this would have to be filled in, so forgive me. It comes down to the question of the Nietzschean child, the Hegelian absolute knower, the Deleuzian individual, and basically someone like the Christ of the Brothers Karamazov. And what we see in Deleuze, so there is a paper I tried to do to compare Derrida, Deleuze, Hegel, and Bergson all together. And Deleuze is they're all incredibly similar, but with small distinctions that make a world of difference, like at the foundation of a building. They all understand that you can't basically have autonomous anything. You can't have autonomous rationality. That becomes totalitarianism and has to be bound. But then the question becomes, what is the binding force, right? Well, for Nietzsche, the binding force is your own values. You choose the noble versus the contemptible, and you hang the law around your neck. So there's something binding here, right? For the absolute knower, the binding principle is the very realization that limit is for phenomenon, that the noumenon is actually an idea in phenomenon for the realization of the phenomenon. And this fundamental lack then actually becomes like an apophatic God, actually. Yeah. That becomes a source of creation. So Master Eckhart and Hegel can be put together. And, Zizek refers to this as dialectical materialism. In Deleuze, the binding principle seems to be a very much alive new materialism that is creatively capable, and that we have to bind ourselves to that creative unfolding that is unlimited in principle, but limited in practice. So there's a fundamental limitlessness that is, though, limited in
the virtual, right? Would you
yes,
call
the
that
virtual, the virtual potential. That's correct. And I really find I really find the books on Deleuze the ones that seem to be really important, but also difficult to work through, is his two books on cinema and his books on Bergson. That actually seems to be the ones that have this really deep metaphysical sort of wrestling with what does it mean if at the end of difference and repetition, if he's going to say that we have to not have epistemologies of representation, if we're going to kind of work against representation. Well, wait a minute, Deleuze. Representation is a binding principle, right? So you're saying we need a binding principle, but not representation. What does that mean then? Well, this is where trying to figure out how his understanding of Bergson goes together with Spinoza is very, very critical. And I'm very interested in books on cinema. To me, what it would suggest is it's a binding to the unlimited. Like you're binding yourself to the virtual, which then is kind of a sweet spot to saying that you don't have to defer all the time. You actually have something that is creative, but it's not full, and you can never capture the fullness of it. So it's almost a difference. The way I kind of think about it, rather correct or wrong, is the way that Deleuze deals with the infinite deferral is to have an infinite unfolding. So there is a thing that's infinitely unfolding that
which is accessible through apprehension, but not through comprehension.
Yes, that's correct, because that's where he's so interested in Bergson's intuition. And I go on and on trying to figure out what intuition is in Bergson, because it's not quite what we tend to think by intuition. And I think that's
it's very interesting because, I'm just fresh from reading the Derrida on spirit again, and it's Geist and esprit and spirit, totally different resonance. And I'm wondering about that word intuition in French. I'll go look for it.
That's actually a fascinating question, Cleo. I'm not 100% sure, but definitely the whole notion for me, like what I try to do is please.
English, it has such a romantic baggage. It is just total romanticism. It may have an entirely different etiology in French, which would be very interesting to know.
Well, from the way I understand it, right or wrong, is that the intuition that Bergson is talking about is very, very similar to what I consider to be the metaphysics of apprehension that is central in Aristotle. And what I mean by that is Aristotle kind of phenomenologically is when I look at a cat, I apprehend substance, substance, and form together as cat. And then you ask me, how do you know that? I don't know. I just apprehend it. There's an initial apprehension that is going on, and then the gap between the signifier and the signified appears. But there's an apprehension and then gap. It seems in Bergson that apprehension is what is paramount. This apprehension that then is a basis. It's a non-rational basis that then rationality follows from, but rationality cannot be reduced to a rational act. And that apprehension
is temporal, right?
Yes.
For Bergson.
Yeah, it's absolutely temporal. And since for Bergson,
so it's fluid. It doesn't fix. It's neither a conjunctive nor a disjunctive synthesis, right? It's something else than that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, correct. Well, the radical thing in Bergson, the way I think about it is where where Einstein talks about space-time, Bergson's basically talking about time-space. And where space is kind of a manifestation of time.
You have the gift of the gab, Dan.
What's that, ma'am? Oh, you're kind. You're kind, Cleo. And so for Bergson, it's like the problem with how we think about synthetic rationality is it's actually all spatial in the background, metaphorically. Right. It all has a space behind it. So he's like, basically, our thinking is entirely wrong because it is spatial. And actually, funny enough, I do align Bergson's critique, what Bergson's thinking of intuition, which I think is Deleuze as well, with Leibniz. And for Leibniz, metaphysics is actually always meta-geometry, not metaphysics, because metaphysics is always situation. There are no things in Bergson, just like in Owen Barfield. Things are kind of a idolatry. There are only situations. And for Leibniz, mathematics really got into a lot of trouble when it started thinking that you could do mathematics without geometrical ergo relation consideration. And so Leibniz is warning, hey, we're thinking about rationality as trying to get to some sort of autonomous number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, some a priori synthetic, when really all human thinking is geometrical. And it makes you think of Plato and Socrates, geometry. If you don't know geometry, don't enter. I know Vervaeke talks about the through line and different things. But really, so But that makes a lot of sense because geometry is relational. And if time is central, time is always relation. Whereas it is possible to imagine space as a point. And so if we understand that we're dealing with time-space, not space-time, like Bergson wants to argue, then rationality is more of always a consideration of a situation that always involves someone as a subject relating, and rationality is the following of the unfolding of the situation, and intuition is a following of the unfolding. And I think that is what Deleuze is getting at, which then meets the sweet spot between it's not unlimited, but it's also not binding, like the givens in sociology, because there is a boundary to the unfolding, but you can follow the boundary through the virtual, ergo it's unlimited and limited. It's kind of unlimited with the parentheses. And for me, something like that is what you require after Derrida.
That helps a lot with Kierkegaard's Bad Infinite, too.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, good. I like it. I like it.
Well, Kierkegaard's Bad Infinite, I definitely associate with Hegel's spurious infinity, because the spurious infinity for Hegel in the Science of Logic is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You always just add another point and you just make a list. Yeah. Whereas true infinity in Hegel is the circle, which is that the circle always relates back to itself. And you can take any points in a circle and just make new points. And it's so, this is the trick. In Hegel, the infinite is always an infinite relation between finite points. So the infinite is contained in the finite, and the finite is contained in the infinite for Hegel. If you do, and that's all geometrical, and Hegel is extremely critical of all algebraic calculus that posits an infinity that is not geometrical. Because once you do that, you're dealing with something spurious. And then Hegel also says, hey, and by the way, our conception of genius and rationality tends to follow what we believe is most fundamental. And if we believe algebraic infinity is possible, then we're going to have a rationality that has no bounds, and it's actually going to be a totalitarian force of destruction. And Kierkegaard understood that, and Deleuze understands that as well.
And that's what we have.
Yes. And Leibniz was very concerned about that.
You're talking about the primacy, the need for geometry in order to keep an open sense of the limit.
Yes. Fascinating is Mr. Alex Ebert, who I do work, who I adore, in his paper in the Hegel anthology we did, he brought to our attention how there's actually a giant debate in mathematics departments of getting rid of the equal sign and replacing it with equivalence, because the equal sign, because technically nothing is equal. They're only equivalent to, and automatically that kind of addresses some of the problem, because what you're saying is two things can only approach, they can be equivalent but not equal. And that's what Leibniz is like, exactly. You can only have equivalence because you can only have relation. You cannot have, it being exactly the same. And also, really funny enough, Leibniz is fascinating because he basically is also arguing that the Trinity is only a contradiction without geometry. The Christian Trinity makes a whole lot of sense if the basis of reality is situation, ergo monad. The monad, you could look at the monad as being what the atom is to things, the monad is to situations. Like the most irreducible point of reality is a situation, which then of course brings to mind the vertical causation of Wolfgang Smith or whatever. And so what he's saying is like, look, all of reality is Trinitarian because the Trinitarian is a kind of situation, an absolute situation, to allude to Hegel, of multiple persons relating to one another. Well, everything in the universe is in the image and likeness of the Trinity. So for Leibniz, replacing metaphysics with metageometry then functions as a kind of overcoming the notion that the Trinity is a contradiction. In fact, the Trinity becomes a revelation of the metastructure of all of reality. And that's what you actually see more and more of mathematics is kind of coming to. Like the only way you overcome the observation, the measurement problem is by positing that all layers of reality are equal. Oh, okay. Well, that means reality is not reducible to digits. It's fundamentally situational. And then you go to Wolfgang Smith, and then you have the problems of string theory that they all have. They say, well, wait a minute. Those problems go away once you start making geometry central. And Leibniz is kind of sitting in the back going, yes. Yes, they do, don't they?
I am I'm trying to deal with my mathematical blindness. My sister always says she's a scientist in the family, and we were at some children's museum. There was a little video tape explaining fractals, little video presentation. And I looked at this wide-eyed, right, little me, and I turned to her and she says that I said, I don't remember saying this, but she swears that I said, there must be something to math after all. So she's cast that in my teeth anyway. But I'm leading up to say I'm a huge devotee and practitioner of the I Ching, which is a mega mathematical structure, right? And in fact, there is quite advanced work on the mathematics of the I Ching, which for some mathematicians actually exceeds their comprehension, the way in which the mathematics of it works, right? But there's the point, which is the start, the point, which is actually got a complicated relationship to the series of exactly the kind we're worried about, right? Then the point becomes a point rather than pointedness out there, it becomes a point, and it immediately generates duality. And the duality itself immediately co-emergently generates a 3. But the gap in the way the I Ching presents itself in its long accretions of layers of hermeneutics, its incredibly complex quality, the gap between those first 2 hexagrams and the third is very marked. And there is a point of mystery right there, which is very, very interesting in terms of what you're saying. So that's an entirely metaphorical and spacey account of that, but I'm just making notes to myself of things that I want to think about more deeply. I thought the other day, God, this would be, I seem to have taken late blooming to a really, I said, I think I'm going to just trot myself off to community college and take a course in math. I think I should do that next year. Start all over again.
Well, Cleo, a few things. First off, I need to read your book on the book you were saying on T.S. Eliot. That sounds extraordinary. I want to comment on that. I will read that. I look forward to that.
It's long ago, but I reread it every once in a while. I say, dang, girl, you nailed that one. My Virgin Mary book had a very complicated anthropological theory, which it's very difficult to give an elevator version of. Sure. And I'm never sure that the train got into the station in that one.
Well, I
book was a donné, you know.
Well,
actually, back to my complete utter joy. Harold Bloom taught it to the day he died in his class.
Wow.
I mean, my son always says I'm going to have that on my gravestone when I die.
Well, I will 100% give it a read. I have my note here, Cleo. I'd love to read it. I'm a big fan of T.S. because I was actually trying to
T.S. Eliot beautifully. Every once in a while you quote T.S. Eliot and I'm melting because you really have a feel when you quote Eliot, you're quoting him in the way that I apprehend him.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. I look forward to your text very much. So first, and I also wanted to say, Cleo, I think you're an inspiration because there was this line out of a friend of mine's book, Philippe Nicholas. He has this lovely line where he says at the end of his poetry collection, he says, in the past, we had to survive to live well, but today we will have to live well to survive. And I think that's exactly true. And it's a lovely line. I'm a good friend of Philippe Nicholas. And I think one of the great challenges today is eldership, how to be old and to be alive, basically. We've associated oldership with stopping learning, retirement, and everything. And this is not correct. This is not what the human is supposed to do. So it's inspiring, Cleo. We don't know what age is because we don't have a concept of an inhabiting of time, like Bruce Alderman was coming out. And we also view age as we associate old with expired versus mastery. We don't associate, in fact, we associate being old with retiring, therefore you don't work anymore, therefore you don't have any mastery. You have nothing to say. So it goes to show you how these metaphoric conflations are so costly, because in the back of your mind, they happen, and then you don't have
They're running a program in the back of your mind. But the other thing about that is that has to be factored in is there's a almost an optic problem with old age. It happened with Pound too, whom my husband wrote brilliantly on.
Wow.
My late husband, my miss. There's a lack of understanding of the quality of silence that has to be observed in old age. And it's Prospero breaks his staff, right? There's a deliberate release of the exercise of a certain kind of power related to a certain kind of charisma. And if you get to that stage, and I'm right there now, where you understand that you're being ethically challenged to release that visible power. And then, of course, you're in a situation where you can easily be mistaken for a doormat.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's a very delicate matter. I mean, you get to a point where you're saying to yourself at every turn, like dealing with your friends who are having relationships issues or issues with their children or whatever, you're saying to yourself, I've seen that pattern before, and I know how that comes out. And then you're saying to yourself, but I have repeatedly seen the exception to the pattern.
Yeah.
And I have no idea which I'm looking at here. Right. So you have a kind of innate humility plus a frustration, because partly you're forever wanting to wave a cautionary flag and say, wait, I know where that's going, right? I feel like this when my friends start talking about polyamory, I'm like, oh, you know? Oh God, I know where that train is headed. I really know where it's headed. And there's going to be blood on the tracks. There's always blood on the tracks. But anyway, that's just an obvious example of it. At the same time, you're saying, I understand that I do not control this mystery, right, and that there's the exception, right? There's the exception. It's a very complicated thing to negotiate, and the things putting up on the chat are very relevant to that. I really like the guy you interviewed, but was it Alderman, Brian? Yes. Alderman?
We spoke with Bruce Alderman at Voicecraft. He's so great. Yeah.
Anyhow, that was a footnote, but you see the problem. I mean, it's related to the problem all along, which is the problem of power in discourse, right? And it's the how to hold that power and how to release it.
I think everything you're getting at is just completely spot on. A few things come to mind. I think the word unfolding is very interesting, because what we see in the word unfolding is some sort of combination of memory, pattern, but also openness to possibility. Like, one of the things that gets us in trouble is we don't believe in patterns anymore, or we overly believe in patterns, right? And it's interesting, like how Bergson, just like Augustine, basically see like, guys, I don't know if memory is what we think it is. I think there's more going on with the mystery of memory than we realize, right? You're not merely recalling the past. There's some sort of transformative act that occurs that is honoring a pattern, bringing a pattern or a possibility in the new so that it can unfold differently. But you need the repetition, like in Derrida, to actually prove the new. Because in Derrida, in Deleuze, the repetition always shows that something is not the same, even though it seems 100% the same, right? So you need memory. The funny thing is that memory or recall is the bringing forth of something that already happened, and that is the very act that unveils it's not the same. And yet you need something that seems the same to so unveil. And so this is why you can't have progress without memory. And the word unfolding is so interesting, because it's like a combination of memory and progress kind of put together. It's like pattern, but progress. It's a pattern, but the pattern is progressing. It's the same, but not the same. And that's a category of thinking that we don't seem to have as well, that may be lended more so in the direction of an oral tradition than a written tradition. Because
go back to that. That makes perfect sense, because really what happens often in conventional ways of thinking of this is that you see what you're just saying, everybody sees that, and then they take the moment of repetition to be the ground, right, instead of a moment. Yes. And that's what Deleuze has done to me, is say that moment of reification is necessary, good, wonderful. It's not just don't take it as the ground. Yes. Right? And I think often also of my shamanic teachers in the Andes, who see time and memory as something in which it's possible to intervene. And they see that you can intervene from the present, you can track backward, and you can change the direction of the stream by putting in a rock or diverting it or opening it up or whatever. And they make this very subtle distinction between the way that stream flows as fate and the way it flows as destiny. And it's that hairline difference between fate and destiny, which is when you're apprehending and swimming in it versus when you're overwhelmed by it, or when you're dictated by it, So yeah, I mean, you're making more sense of that Bergson memory thing, which is also baffled me. Do you know the work of Christian Kerslake? Do you know his
I do
work?
not. I do not.
You might want to look at that. He's an expositor of Bergson, of Deleuze, of a lot of things. And I find him just quite brilliant. Kerslake. I gather he's a kind of eccentric guy, lives in London. He's a friend of a friend. I don't really know him well, but his work is very good, and he's very, very good at excavating with a very sharp analytic point the Freudian and Jungian contribution to this.
Interesting.
He's fully able as a philosopher. He's really a philosopher, so he's not. There's no reduction, right? Wow. But he does show you things in Freud and Jung that are very interesting from this point of view. So I just offer you that piece of bibliography. I'm always spouting bibliography.
Well, I like bibliography because it's quite difficult to know what to read in this world, and to have guidance to have guidance from somebody who is so well read is a thrill. So thank you. I appreciate it. The memory
I'm not well. One of the things that's another blind spot. You should know my blind spots while we're talking: mathematics and cinema. I can't abide film. I can't watch it. For me, it is all the production of images in the worst sense. It leaves me, I walk out and I feel yucky, And I think it's because I grew up, until I was 12 years old, I never saw a TV or a film.
Sure.
I was a reader from the time I was 5. So there's a kind of I'm almost monotheistic in my dislike of the image.
Sure.
So there's that. So I can never follow Deleuze's work on cinema. I suppose I could if I got over my fear that it's about the movies. I know it's not about the movies, so maybe I'll get at it. But you think there's crucial stuff there and in Bergson?
I think his books on cinema are frankly more about the metaphysics of cinema than they are movies, and he thinks that the cinema. The cinema for him is metaphorically extremely useful to sort of get at some of the metaphysics. And of all the things to decide to kind of not indulge in, I think not indulging in movies and imagery is a good thing. I don't watch many movies because, it's not that I have anything against them. It's just there is something, one must be careful of what one puts in themselves. And these things do develop habits. They do develop habits and ways of thinking. So I applaud you in that. A few other things. I really like what you're saying about the river. Because I think what we see on this kind of intervening, there has to be something there to intervene. Intervening is a lovely word because it means you just can't create. You can't just say there are no patterns or there are no memories, right? There has to be something you're working with. And what that sort of suggests is that memory is the only way to be free. Because if you can't remember what occurred, you don't know how to intervene to change the course, right? Like a lot of people, if you're in a river and you could change the course of the river, sure, you're still being carried along, but there has been a freedom in that because the direction of the river has shifted. There are certainly patterns and tendencies within history, but these things don't have to carry us along. If we know how to intervene with them, then we can have a certain exercise of a difference between destiny and fate. And I think that is basically the way to kind of think about free will and determinism in the correct way. There are things that move, but the things that move can be moved. And although they must keep moving us, the directionality of them can be shifted. And it makes me also think on this kind of idea where in Deleuze, the repetition unveils the difference. Similarly, I think we actually see evidence in freedom precisely if somebody, say, comes up into you and says, hey, Cleo, you want to go to the movies? And you say, I really don't. Well, you've clearly lost something. A moment ago, you didn't have to face me, and now you're not free not to face my offer. And what if I'm upset? What if I think you're crazy or something, right? So in the negative, the loss of the freedom, there's actually a kind of evidence that there was something there that has now been taken. But the funny thing is since you're always in the river, per se, of freedom, you don't feel it until you come up on a potential bend, and then you see it. And that then also starts to show us why memory and thus eldership is central for progress. Because without an understanding of how the river flows, then when somebody, say, comes up to you, you won't know how the direction to shift. And another way, I think, to get at that is what that means is precisely where the oral tradition contacts writing, that's kind of the age now, actually. It's like you have the freedom that is the oral, that had its period, it invented writing, which is more stagnant. It's more kind of deterministic. And now the question is, what is the negation sublation, where we can actually figure out how to use writing in service of the oral, as opposed to replacing the oral. The oral seems to be the mystery. The writing seems to be the interpretation. You put them together, you might interpret the mystery. Likewise, you can have the eldership intervening on the patterns, and now we can have a new possibility of freedom. However, we're not going to have that possibility of freedom if we don't do this simultaneous, in the same way that there's this need of going into memory for Augustine to get to God, to get to the essence and truth that is brought into the present, the same for Bergson. Likewise, we today in a written tradition, logocentric, has to go back to the oral, not nostalgically to escape the present, but to bring the oral into the written, to figure out what exactly it would look like to have free writing, per se, or a liberated and that would be an unfolding. What would it look like to have writing that is alive? You know, it makes me think, as you know, you know, the way that I always liked how Samuel Beckett described Joyce, Finnegan's Wake. He said, well, you got to understand that Joyce is trying to make the word water dance. He wants the word itself to dance. He wants the language itself to dance. And I've always thought of what Beckett is describing about Joyce to actually be precisely our challenge today. And that's what Derrida was kind of in my opinion, it was something like a oral writing, a kind of a live text where the word itself, where water itself is wet. And of course, that sounds very strange, but that would be the newness. That would be the unfolding. That seems to be open. And that would, of course, be geometrical as well, right? Because it's not just a point, it's something that's alive and it's acting in different things. So,
and what I want to do with the opening of Genesis is make it dance.
Yes.
And see where it dances you, you know? And also see that you are, in a sense, participating in that creation ex nihilo as you dance, right? You're doing that work. Yeah, that's really lovely, Daniel. That's the oral thing. When I long ago I tried to write something about the opening of John's Gospel, the logos in relation to Derrida, and while I was fooling around with that, as you can see, I like etymology, misleading as it can be, but I found out that the translation of logos in the St. Jerome Bible, in the Latin Bible, is sermo, which is not sermon as we know it, except that it's oral. In the beginning was the sermo, is what it says in Latin, right? Not the word in the sense of this reified thing, but the discourse, right? In the beginning was the discourse, and sermo in Latin apparently just has that kind of meaning of like an ongoing conversation is a sermon.
Wow.
You know, I mean, it doesn't pertain to the Greek where logos is logos, but getting out of the Greek metaphysics is important there. So yeah, I mean, the oral written thing is wonderful. I'm going to use this. I'm glad you're recording this.
To me, Finnegan's Wake is a fascinating text because it feels Finnegan's Wake is fascinating to me, and I've written a lot trying to see it as the negation sublation of the written oral thing, because Finnegan's Wake feels like a spoken book, which is really weird. It feels as if it's literally written speaking. It's a very strange thing, and to me,
it's almost like rap. I mean, it's almost like
rap. Sure. Well, and of course, it's just full to the brim. I actually, funny enough, Cleo, for me, thinking about what does community, society, and all these, you know, Given Reef and all the people, Berger that I mentioned, and the problem of Givens and all that, the hip hop cipher is actually central as an emergent structure. You never know what's going to happen yet, but it's not random. The cipher is kind of the logic, it's what the clearing needs in Heidegger. It's what the opening needs. It's something like a cipher, and a cipher in hip hop is very interesting. And Finnegan's Wake is a book of hip hop in a way, because in a cipher, you have no idea what's going to occur. It looks like nothing's there. And then something occurs. And once it occurs, it's like, well, of course that would occur. It had to have been that. It has a kind of air of necessity. And so the hip hop cipher is a beautiful blurring of necessity and yet openness. And what we seem to be, what Deleuze understands, what Philip Rieff understands, what all these different things that Leibniz are understanding is that there's some sort of open structure that you're looking for that we haven't had to think yet. And Finnegan's Wake is a kind of open structure, right? It's a book, it's written, and yet you can't reduce it to the writing. There are parts where it only makes sense when you say it aloud, or you have to look outside of the text to get what it's getting at, because it's incorporate, like the part, I guess, in Finnegan's Wake, where the thunder is, the lightning is this long word, because he's playing on Vico, where lightning is the source of language, and he has loud, because in the church it's loud, or the TV that I know Echo, the Brian Echo liked, and different things. So all of these things are in the text. It's a structure. But if I were to say to you, what's Finnegan's Wake? A book. Oh, is it? So, there's something very...
Eduardo Cohn, great anthropologist. Yes. I don't know his... Do you know How Forests Think?
Yes.
A book that I did not read for a long time because I thought it was about how trees talk to each other, and I know that. And then I found it, and it's one of the 2 or 3 books where the last chapter made me cry. But it captures something about the relationship between knowledge and speech that you're talking about. Let me go back and just another anecdotal reference that I have always loved. The story is told of Kafka, that he wrote those things in the middle of the night, and he would get up and go to the cafe in the morning and read them aloud to his friends. He'd write them weeping. He'd read them aloud, and everybody's cracking up.
They're laughing, yeah.
Which is partly the oral, right, versus the written, and it's partly that laughter of the transformative process of the writing itself, right? It's just a wonderful pointer to what apprehension is versus comprehension, to use your terminology, and also a lovely thing.
That's a wonderful story of Kafka. And I think laughter and tears are always interesting, because you laugh when you're crazy and when you're happy, you cry when you're sad and when you're happy. So there's an ambiguity in those that fundamentally points to this mystery that we're getting at, that seems to be quite central. And a cipher is mysterious. It's uncertain, but it's not the uncertainty of interpretation. It's the uncertainty of mystery.
Yes, exactly. Great. I got it. Yeah.
And so similarly, a situation, you can only have mystery in geometry, because you have to have relations of things that are not reducible to one another, so that then you could have a mystery. Whereas if you have points, like algebraic point, then you can have only interpretation. Where in geometry, you can have mystery and interpretation. In sort of the point calculus that Leibniz is concerned about, you can only have interpretation. And so another way to think about that, what the cipher does is the cipher is a geometrical situation. It is a circle, everyone is relating to one another, and it's a true infinity in the Hegelian sense, because it could emerge to who knows what, right? Because everyone could relate to what the last one says. So you have a structure that's geometrical. It's a source of a true infinity, not a spurious infinity, and yet it's contained in the finite. It shows that the infinite is possible in the finite in a kind of incarnational sort of sense, and it shows you that order can be created. And I think the cipher, Finnegan's Wake, all of these things as a kind of oral speaking are pointing to what has to come after Derrida. What actually is sort of needed, and what would it mean to, and also I meant to note, oral tradition is geometrical, right? I'm speaking to you, we're in space, face to face. So the oral is geometrical. The oral is geometrical. Writing is going to be more algebraic. And today the question is, how do we have the Finnegan's Wake? How is this the age, not the oral, but the kind of the Finnegan's Wake tradition, or the cipher tradition versus the oral tradition or the written tradition? And to me, that becomes very Trinitarian. That's very kind of geometrical.
Well, let me tell you where I am with this right now. As you speak, of course, I'm thinking about the end of the Commedia. Because when Dante sees down into the heart of light, what does he see? He sees the geometric form. Yes. And the face of Christ, and it's a gestalt. It's a toggle, yes. Right? And it's that geometrical. I mean, you can tell from the way that he expresses it that those two things, the actual realistic representational image of the face and the geometry, are two halves of the same coin. You can't, and at the same time, you can't hold them in your mind simultaneously, because your mind will break. if you hold them simultaneously. So it's at that point that he says, I can't say anything more about this.
Yep.
I basically pass out here.
Oh, yeah.
I basically faint here, right? Because I think he saw the crystallization of that paradox. And I think it's just brilliant to remind me about the geometrical principle behind this. Because yes, this is very helpful to me and very challenging. So all good.
You have it would be difficult for me to express my appreciation of the incorporation of Dante, because I think you can absolutely see a movement from much more point imagery, algebraic imagery and Inferno to geometric imagery once he gets to the point where his wings fail the lofty fantasy for the love that moves the sun and other stars. And we also have critically in the when he's speaking with Beatrice, maybe Canto 32, he's kind of, no, it's a little early where he's like, Beatrice, why won't you smile? You're never smiling. And Beatrice is like, well, buddy, let me tell you, if I were to smile at this point, you'd be reduced to ash like Semele, right? Because the glory would be too great. So what you have in Dante, not only do you have a centrality of geometry, but you also have this understanding of the hiddenness of grace, like the hiddenness of history you would, having to be developmental. You have to go through a period, because if it happens too soon, you'll be reduced to ash. You'll be overwhelmed, right? And actually, ergo, the hiddenness of God is an expression of God's love. The fact that grace holds itself back actually saves you, right? And so another way to think, like, in the same way that we had to move through oral to written to now the written oral, I'll say cipher if you just grant me that. If you went straight to cipher, you would have been reduced in history to ash, right? So you had to gradually develop now, and this is very Hegelian, because for Hegel, history is progressive, but that doesn't mean there's a future. The future is always better than the past, but there may not be a future because we destroy ourselves. So in history, like in Hegel, there is a progress, but it's contingent. And it's contingent upon a sort of realization and development of the person to handle the change, right? And what's kind of we see now is a need to be able to handle the cipher in the same way that Dante gradually has to have his eyes adjust to see more grace. So and then at the end, at the top, Beatrice finally smiles. In the same way, we've had to move to history, working through the oral, then through the
that's
written.
Parallel to Arjuna seeing the face of Krishna for the first time.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Right? To that, and parallel as well to to that wonderful moment in Dante early on in the beginning of the Paradiso, where he catches sight of the ladies dancing on the green sward. He's seeing the kingdom, and essentially, and he looks at them, and I think it's Martha turns to him and says, "What are you doing here? Don't you know that here is a place where men are happy?" Right? And she's saying, "You will die if you come here now. You're totally unprepared for this experience." So I really love this sense also of progressive ordeal that you're getting at. Just another aside, I'm going to have to go soon, although I could talk to you for 100 years, Dan.
This has been a blast.
My Andean shamans who are quite amazing. I mean, I've studied shamanic traditions in anthropology for 20 years. And in my view, this Andean material, some of the Lakota, some of the Siberian, but the Andean, it's the highest form of shamanism I know, right? And its cosmology is exquisite and extremely sophisticated. So that you really just can't talk about the oral tradition. You cannot get it off the page. They don't even like to transliterate Quechua.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, but anyway, I've been privileged to have a monthly meeting with a very senior shaman, and he is talking endlessly about what they call a Pachacuti, which is an overturning of the worlds, which is what we're facing, right? It's the apocalypse, essentially. And we keep coming up to it, and everybody anxiously says, but what do we do? And his whole answer is, prepare yourself through ordeal. Right. And it's apprehend this thing as an entity in itself. And you see what I'm saying? I mean, this, again, concept of ordeal, which is a Kristeva thing, the thing I got from Kristeva anyway, is very central to this, because that preparation is very complicated.
Oh yeah. Well, so there's, and alas, I've enjoyed this, and I'll have to go myself, but I've really, really enjoyed this for the last few minutes. And I definitely have always wanted to do a paper, and I haven't written on seeing the Commedia as a movement from algebra to geometry, because I think
Daniel.
Well, you're very kind, because I definitely think in the imagery, it moves from people to groups. You have the birds forming the letters. You have all of these different, much more geometrical
have the
imagery.
Scattered leaves of Virgil gathered into one volume.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so I appreciate that. And to me,
go ahead. We might bounce that around between us and try to generate something really short and clear on that.
That would be fun. I think
I just want to say something meta before we part ways. So we're going to do this again, which is that, you know, the way we're talking and the way that I have entered these conversations through you and through Justin and through my great mentor Glenn Wallace. We're not speaking in any way in the way that we would need to be speaking if we were in academia, which is very interesting to me as a recovering academic. Glenn is kind of pressing me to turn this Substack newsletter stuff into an academic book. And I have to think about that.
I'm honored that you would plant that seed. Second, I'm fascinated. Third, it is completely the case that some sort of, dare I say, new take of theology is utterly necessary. The phrase Eucharistic theology. Well, in the same way, to me, it actually applies to academia as well that you were mentioning. So basically, it's all stuck in the written logocentrism, basically.
Absolutely.
And you see, what we're seeing today is the need for, I'll just say cipher-centricism, if we use that phrase right now. Basically, what is necessary is this is the age of what does college look as cipher? What does theology look as cipher? What does academic exchange look as cipher? Because that's what you were saying, that this kind of dialogue couldn't happen in a logocentric. No, it could not. And this is where, in Hegel, what's very interesting is for Hegel, he views technology as a manifestation of the implicit that the explicit needs to negate it, sublate itself to the next age. Now, it's an imprecise process, but the very creation of Zoom, what's so interesting about Zoom, to be meta, is this is kind of a middle between oral and written, right? It's being recorded. It is creating a kind of artifact, but you actually forget. You're actually forgetting that you're writing as you're speaking. So as you record, you are kind of recording, dictating, but also you forget that you are writing, and it's a capturing of speech. So this is very cipher in the Zoom. Also, I think basically theology has become, basically in Christianity, a lot of the orthodoxy is father-centric. We actually, when we talk about God, forget we're talking about the Trinity. And the moment you're talking about the Trinity, you're talking about a geometry, and you're also talking about a son that is incarnational. So these things are at the very essence of God. Yes, Orthodox people know this. They speak it when you bring it up to them, but it doesn't permeate their entire framework of thought as it should. Because if it permeates, it changes everything. And the closing point I'll make, because I know you have to run and I'll run as well, but we will do this again, and I will read your books, and I look forward to them, and we should have discussions about them, and we can move forward, because I'm very interested on the topic. To me, what we're seeing today is a kind of, I like to talk about conditionalism. You know, you had subjectivism, you had objectivism, and I like to talk about conditionalism. And what I mean by conditionalism is, take for example, In Praise of Shadows by Tazagotchi, right, the Japanese writer. And there's this idea that a shadow is very interesting because it's a middle between dark and light, right? You have to create certain conditions in order to create the shadow. And for him, Western artificial light was aesthetically terrible because it destroyed the effect of the shadow. And for him, Japanese aesthetics were very big on this kind of shadow. But it's interesting because it's a kind of condition is necessary to create the shadow, right? Well, let's take also a painting, maybe someone like thinking Hans Ruckmacher, right? Like a painting only works because all of the colors are in the right place at the right time with the right shape. There's a certain condition that is needed for painting to emerge. Likewise, I, as the viewer of the painting, have to stand the right distance from the painting to have the effect of the painting. If I'm too close, it doesn't work. If I'm too far away, it's like C.S. Lewis talked about mountains. He said the perfect way to view mountains is that middle space between too far away and too close, right? So there's a condition that has to be met. Well, let's think of a veil. What's a veil? A veil is a middle space between an open field and a wall. If you didn't know that there was something behind it, it wouldn't be a veil, right? So it has to be movable, but it also has to shield. So there's all these kind of ontological calibrations that are between subject and object. What's that, ma'am?
Throw a mirror in there.
Yes.
A mirror is a very interesting because it does the same difference thing as well.
Absolutely.
And there's a very good history of the development of mirrors in human culture. Can't remember it, but really think about it. It's a very recent invention, and it has profoundly affected our consciousness.
Completely.
And I think some of the subject-object hang-up comes from the presence in our lives of mirrors.
Oh, 100%. Completely. I have a poem called The Rain Stage, which is kind of the play on the mirror stage of Lacan, where prehistoric man saw his image and he saw it in a puddle. And it's like now there's the object of the subject in different things. So it creates that. I think that's a very good insight. And for me, the word conditioning. So there is certain conditions that have to be met for shadows, veils, paintings, mirrors, all these different things. Likewise, for a bookcase to be a bookcase, I have to condition the material correctly. I have to put the nails in the woods and so on and so forth and create the condition. Well, here's the question. Is conditionalism subjective or objective? Well, it's both, right? Because you couldn't get the bookcase as an object unless it was conditioned by a subject. And then once I invent the bookcase, it works back on me, changes my subjectivity like a book and so on and so forth, right? So this is the issue. Like, and also you go to the gym to condition. You work out, what are you doing? You're conditioning yourself, right? So likewise, what we're seeing today is we need a conditionalism theology. We need a conditionalism academia. The cipher is fundamentally a conditionalism situation. There are conditions, we're in the circle, but everyone has also trained an artistic ability so that you meet all the conditions and you create the hip hop cipher, right? Likewise, we have a Zoom conversation. We have the condition of the Zoom. We've all read, we've read the books. We're interested. We're here. We meet the conditions to have a certain effect. We have not had a theology or metaphysics that is conditionalism based. It's either been subject object or kind of getting rid of both. Right. And the issue is that actually the human being is capable of creating and entering into conditions that then change the quality of reality and experience that then works back on the person back and forth. And what is that? A dance. It is a dance of the circle and the circle with a human effigy is in the middle. And the question is, how do they fit? You can't think it all at once without failing the lofty fantasy, but that doesn't mean you can't participate in it. Dante actually is pulled into the dance when his wings fail. The failure of the lofty fantasy is the inability to write about it, because at that point you've entered into the cipher. It will no longer do to try to write it. You have to now participate. And the Trinity is ultimately an invitation, and the Eucharist is ultimately an invitation to participate into that. But you have to meet the conditions of the ritual, of all of these different things. And I think, to me, on the question, too, of if there's going to be sacrifice in heaven, like you were saying at the beginning, there's probably going to be conditionalism. There's probably going to be certain conditions that people meet to be possibly part of the cipher that has a sacrificial edge to it, because you have to give up things to condition yourself. And conditionalism is part of the sacrifice that is in participation that makes it possible to be of that dance at the still point where all things are one and the fire and rose can be together and neither consumed. So I think thinking in terms of conditionalism and theology and academia that open these things up is the horizon that we need to consider today.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm all charged up.
Well, I appreciated it. Well, Cleo, we will do this again. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a treat.